Welcome to A Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown, with your hosts Chris Robinson and Fleur Summers.
Over the course of this series, Fleur and I will be discussing some of the main themes and concepts surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 and what it will mean to the public sector ahead of launch. Fleur and I have a combined 40 years public sector procurement experience and will be using some of that experience to share our knowledge and insights around the Act itself.
So let's get into today's topic.
Welcome to episode 6 of A Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown. Today we're going to be covering the changes to the routes to market within the Procurement Act 2023.
So this is one of the key areas of change, isn't it? And it's a topic voted by you, our listeners, in our recent poll. But this is going to have quite a significant impact in terms of how procuring authorities carry out their procurements going forwards.
And we're going to start off by having a look at the new procedures that are available within the Act itself. And of course, as we know, it's well documented that once the Act and subsequent procurement regulations are implemented, they will bring about several changes to those routes to market, or, as also known, of course, the procedures themselves, in comparison to what is currently permitted within the existing public contract regulations.
So I think before we jump into what we are going to see going forwards with the new Procurement Act, let's just take a few minutes to just recap on what procedures we've got currently under the existing procurement regulations. So we all know we have the open procedure, which these are probably ones that we've all used, especially like the open procedure, your restricted two-stage procedure. We then get into the competitive procedure with negotiation, or CPN, and then competitive dialogue, and then a new one that came in, back in 2015, the latest change of the regulations, the innovation partnership. So these are sort of what we've all been known to be using over the past few years in terms of our procurements, but this is all set to change with the introduction of the Procurement Act.
So it's a case of out with the old and in with the new. And
slightly. So there's some that are the same, but yeah.
A little bit more reduced in terms of quantity,
yes,
so for sure. And I think actually just to build onto that, it was evident early on when we reflect back on the journey of the Act itself and where we find ourselves today, that the various consultation exercises, the target behind which was to streamline the procedures.
Yeah, they've definitely done that.
Oh, they certainly have, yeah. And this, again, the discussion that we're having today as part of the podcast around the routes to market will identify that further.
So if we make a start, so obviously we previously had the open procedure, so this will be remaining. So there will still be a one-stage open procedure that we will be able to use as part of the new Procurement Act. So it will incorporate some other amendments that are being seen with the Act, such as changes to timescales, award criteria, notice requirements, the mandatory discretionary exclusion of grounds, and those type of things. But ultimately, the open procedure will still be available to be used in the same way that we use it now.
I'm sure that'll come as a great comfort to the sector.
Something that's similar, something that's known, yeah.
Rather than a wholesale change, definitely. Yeah. So then when we move on to the competitive flexible procedure itself, now this is brand new.
This is brand new, but it's almost like we've got the competitive flexible procedure that's now taking on all the others into this one process.
Yeah, exactly that point. Insofar as the process that's being implemented within the Act itself will replace the previous 4 remaining procedures that could have been used under the existing PCRs, as you've just reeled through earlier on.
But I think one of the key things that the competitive flexible procedure will allow is the tailoring of procurement to what is specifically being procured. And I think that's something that has been missing. You've always had to just do a certain procedure because that's what the procedures say. But having this flexibility, which it's going to include, is going to give that ability to say, well, actually for this requirement, because the market works in X way, we'll be able to do X, Y, Z in our process, because you can build that in terms of how it's going to work.
Definitely, and that keyword flexibility, and
that's going to be used a lot, isn't it?
For sure, and it's actually going to give the sector the ability to do that, and I'm sure will be a welcome change. And we are going to run through the benefits and considerations of this particular approach in a moment or two. But with that flexibility, hopefully it will encourage the sector to be a little bit more innovative.
Yeah.
In terms of
try something new.
Yeah, as part of the ask of what the procurement exercise is under this procedure, and for sure, building upon that, it'll be interesting to see how the innovative approaches or what types of innovative approaches the sector will take within this new procedure, and again how it is interpreted once the Act and regulations themselves are live. We're not that far away now.
We're not, no.
The date we keep reiterating here is the 28th of October. That's the targeted go live. So again, I think it's an ideal opportunity for public procurement bodies to start forward planning and trying, I think, once live, make the most of the competitive flexible procedure itself.
And I think you mentioned a key thing there, Chris, isn't it? Interpretation. So how do they interpret it? And obviously different authorities, different risk profiles, different interpretations as to what you can do. That's going to be interesting to see. And also, are we just going to see some that are staying the same? I'm comfortable over here with just this process. I don't need to make it too complicated, and then see what others are doing and then say, oh, okay, maybe I might add this little bit in, or not go big bang all at one time.
I think one thing that we can certainly rely upon, which will be a continued behaviour of the sector, is this sharing of best practice.
Yeah, definitely.
Amongst organisations within the sector, and there will be no doubt, along with a number of the routes that we're going to be discussing today, a little bit of trial and error.
Yeah.
And I think those organisations that they take those first tentative brave steps around this approach in particular, the encouragement of sharing best practice, what went well, what didn't go so well, will be beneficial to the sector as a whole.
Yeah, and I think there's also some local authorities obviously are doing light touch procurements, which already have this flexibility sort of, don't they? So there will be some that can take, well, we've done this over here, this works in the light touch world, let's bring this in and use it under competitive flexible. Definitely.
So if we have a look at perhaps maybe some of the abilities or what the procedure itself actually provides here, the number of participating suppliers to be limited generally or in relation to particular tendering rounds or other selection processes.
Yeah, so I think it gives that ability, doesn't it? It's almost bits from the dialogue or those sort of processes where you might be able to refine your award criteria or have reduction in suppliers as you go through the different stages that you might want to build in. I think it's very, very flexible. There's that word again.
The word again, flexibility, and yet again, hopefully building some creativity and innovation within this approach itself. And how about the provision with regards to the exclusion of suppliers under certain circumstances? What we're going to see from that, is that almost going to be a prerequisite pass-fail, continually reviewed under this approach, I would suggest?
Yeah, it's all going to be things that are going to watch this space, isn't it? How are we going to take it?
The ability for the sector to be freely available to design the procurement processes to follow, as long as the approach is made clear and detailed right at the point. Yeah, go on, I'll let you tell a bit.
That's going to be the key thing, isn't it? Getting it clear, detailed, so that everyone knows how the process is going to work, how many stages, is there going to be a refinement and reduction in number of suppliers. It all needs to be clear and upfront in those published procurement documents.
Yeah. With this procedure, then, the competitive flexible procedure, should we take a look at some of the high level benefits and considerations now?
I think we've probably covered off quite a few of those, haven't we? But yeah, as we've mentioned, flexibility. It is flexible. You can take it how you want and design it. You've got your multi-stage ability. You could have multiple different stages built in, and you can build it from there depending on what your requirement is or how you want it to work.
I think that comes with an element of risk as well.
Definitely.
I think we've talked about in previous podcast recordings around the stabilisers being taken off.
Yeah.
And I think actually what we have to be careful of as a sector, or the sector itself needs to be cautious of, is not overcomplicating and having too many stages. With this, of course, will come a degree of administration and resource, and how intense that resource will be required to administer this particular procedure.
And don't you think a key area for that might be pre-market engagement, getting that insight from the market in terms of this is what we're thinking, or being able to use that and then building that into your process.
Please forgive me for saying this, but almost that market engagement, the pre-market engagement, as we covered with Kieran in the previous podcast, identifying the art of the possible.
No, definitely that terminology.
How about in relation to best fit? Is that again, a further steer and drive towards, as we know, the move away from meat to mat?
Yeah, but also very requirement specific. So yeah, you've got the meat to mat, but you can, different contracts, procurements, categories, those areas work differently, don't they? And something that might work in one procurement for a certain type of contract might not necessarily fit for another type of contract that you're procuring. So you can get that best fit for what you are actually purchasing and looking for, and what the market in those areas are doing.
A procurement exercise ready-made, fit for its intended purpose.
Yeah, there you go.
So how about some of the considerations here? Anything in particular note worth picking up?
I think we've covered quite a lot of them, haven't we? And just when discussing it, so pre-market engagement is going to be key. The number of suppliers that you're going to have at the different stages, the number of stages in general. And obviously a key theme throughout the whole of the Procurement Act is transparency and being clear and open with everyone in terms of how it's going to work.
This is the best behaviour that's adopted by the sector anyway, so shouldn't really pose any challenges, I would suggest.
Yeah.
We did actually have some questions from the listeners as part of the poll in relation to routes to market. We'll go through a couple of those now then. So one of the questions we received was the idea of whether or not we'll see more tailored or design processes, or will we just see the same restricted two-stage process. I know, Fleur, you've touched on this earlier on, being followed initially, as that is known as a process that could result in any potential a reduced potential for challenge.
Yeah, I think it's let's wait and see. I think, and that's probably what a lot of the public sector authorities will be doing in terms of seeing who makes those first steps into something very different, and seeing how that works, or what doesn't work in terms of that. Yeah, I think it really is going to be a wait and see, unfortunately.
Yeah. Another great question we received was in relation to whether or not there'll be any differences in what has been published if using the competitive flexible procedure.
So we've already mentioned sort of briefly on this, but so the approach is designed in terms of how you want the process to be run will still need to be advertised. You still have to clearly define the different areas in terms of your published procurement documents, like how many stages are you reducing your number of suppliers at any stage of that. Are you going to have any form of negotiation included in it? Because that's an extra stage that you have to go through. So I think, there's a number of things that need to be considered.
In terms of proportionality, anything worth mentioning?
That's a big area, isn't it?
It is, isn't it?
I guess you always have to have in the back of your mind proportionality in terms of what is actually being purchased and the value, and whether are you designing something that is overly complicated for the value of the contract, or, does it feel right for what is being purchased?
Mm-hmm. The recent guidance notices that we've had in relation to the Act itself, there's been a hell of a lot of material produced in relation to the contract notices.
Yeah.
And the procurement documents for, in this instance, competitive flexible procedures that are published following the launch. That's going to be a real learning curve for the sector. And again, as we've already reiterated and covered in some of our recent blog posts, the variety of notices that are available that will be available upon the point of launch, which will be most likely of interest, as they will give insight to the methods that are actually being considered. Okay, so the Act also introduced a strengthened requirement around pre-market engagement. Fleur, you've touched on this. We covered it in the podcast 5 with Kieran and the value around that, and the fact that it can be carried out by contracting authorities in advance of formal commencement of the procurement process, as well as the notices that have to be published themselves. And I think earlier on, Fleur, you were discussing preliminary market engagement notice in particular. Around that, in a way, not too dissimilar to the approach of a PIN notice, you'd suggest.
No, but I think these are going to be the first indications, aren't they, as to whether authorities are going to try something different in terms of what they're considering. It's going to be an interesting time. And
again, stands to reason that, as we know already, market engagement will be one of the first areas that will need to be considered by the sector for any new procurement processes in general. These notices could be a useful indication of the approaches that are being considered.
Yeah, even like the different stages or different elements of the process that they're thinking of doing. Like, are they going to have demonstrations, presentations, site visits, negotiations, dialogue? These notices are going to be where the information is, I think.
Definitely. Innovative approaches, flexible and innovative approaches. So should we move on to direct award now? Is
Yeah.
it worth us, sitting
Worth
here?
touching on it. It's still a procedure that will be available, isn't it?
And again, direct award, of course, in its existing guise is well established. It's certainly embraced by the sector. We know, as well as I would suggest, if not all, the majority of our listeners will be aware of the benefits around such an approach. And again, alongside the changes to the procedures that will be available within the Act itself, it is, as you've just said, Flo, we're spending a little bit of time noting around this approach, in that there will be some amendments as to how and when the direct award approach can be utilised.
Yeah, so the Act makes it clear that public contracts must be awarded following a competitive tendering procedure. But if a direct award justification applies, the public sector authorities will be able to award a contract directly without a competitive tendering procedure. So I think there's some changes that have come in terms of like direct award in special cases, or direct award to protect life and those type of things. So there are some slight differences that we're going to see as to the reasons why direct award could be applicable.
Now, those two scenarios that you talked about there, special cases and the direct award to protect life, for example, there are two particular areas of the sector where I think this is probably in very much the forefront of the mind when the Act itself was created and the subsequent regulations. Now, of course, what I'm thinking about here is the NHS and defence.
Defence, yeah, definitely.
And for the obvious reasons of the undertakings from a procurement perspective of those two areas, there's a necessity for us to
still have that ability to direct award. Yeah, definitely.
So without getting too geeky or nerdy, of course, we've in our recent blog post around this theme talked about what is contained within Schedule 5 of the Act in relation to the direct award justifications, and again, the prior reading, the understanding of what will be permissible ahead of go live will be important for the sector to appreciate and have full awareness of. And prototypes and development. So we're talking about there, I would suggest, new emerging technologies.
Something innovative, new areas.
Which might, as a general perspective for the sector, be outside of the norm of their typical procuring arrangements and what they tend to acquire, by way of their goods, works and services. We have single supplier instances, like, for example, the very definition, bespoke provisions. So unique work of art, intellectual property rights, no reasonable alternatives, absence of completion, etc.
They're very similar to what we've already seen recently in current rules, aren't they?
Yeah. I can think of, actually, without digressing too much, one particular instance where where I worked previously, we exercised the right to go down this approach. It was actually in relation to a unique piece of art itself, and it was actually the removal of a statue. Something that was created by an artist that was protected by way of nature of what it was, and we actually had to appoint a specialist art removal firm that could actually not only remove it to ensure that it wasn't damaged while coming out of the ground, but actually stored suitably, transported and suitably stored in such a way that it actually protected that. So
I guess this sort of ability to direct award in that sort of instance would have been
sure. And just to clarify, the reason for that procurement exercise was for a tramway extension. Where actually, believe it or not, the tramway extension and with the position of this statue itself was, as you can imagine, smack bang in the middle of where the tramway network extension was taking place. Hence the need to appoint a unique art handler / removal firm to do that activity.
So I think there's some other areas like urgency, reasons for extreme and unavoidable urgency that could not have been foreseen, user choice contracts. So that links into some of the light touch contracts where services are supplied for benefit of a particular individual, where that could be a justification as to why a direct award is required. And obviously you mentioned defence and security being a key area as well.
I think it's a given, isn't it? One of the earlier points that you just touched on there in relation to urgency and for extreme and unavoidable urgency, that no doubt when the Act itself was creating the regulations within that at the forefront of people's minds in that regard was a byproduct of COVID-19.
Pandemic clause, the new one. But I think one of the key areas in terms of direct award to be aware is the level of transparency and how that has increased compared to what it is in the current regulations. So obviously now we have the requirement to publish a VEET notice. However, it's not mandatory. But under the new Procurement Act, there will be mandatory requirements to publish a number of notices in terms of your direct awards. So not only will we have a sort of thing like the transparency notice, we'll also have to do like a contract award notice and a contract details notice. So I think in terms of direct awards, having that justification as to why you're doing it really needs to stack up, because you're going to have to publish this. So it's going to have to really be something that truly is a direct award.
Yeah, and I think that comes hand in hand with what you just mentioned there, that on the face of it, there appears to be greater ability to utilise direct awards, but it comes with that caveat.
You're going to have to publish why, yeah.
It'll be interesting to see, actually, once the Act goes live, the amount of due diligence, justification checking, scrutiny that will be in play when reviewing the content of these notices.
Because they're going to have to detail why you're doing a direct award. What justification have you got for doing it? Yeah, it's going to be interesting seeing those notices. So where do we go from here then, Chris, in terms of the competitive flexible procedure? And I think one of the areas we talked about with Kieran on our previous podcast episode was in terms of public sector authorities' procurement policies and procedures, and reviewing those to make sure that they're up to date, align to the new requirements and the procedures, but specifically how they want to interpret them and how they want to enable competitive flexible procedure.
We spent quite a bit of time, didn't we, as you say, speaking with Kieran in the previous podcast around the importance of internal procurement policies, procedures, standing orders. I think, if memory serves me right, we covered off as well. Now, and what we said in the previous podcast in relation to this point was we have the Act, we have the regulations, but the reality of it is, outside of procurement professionals within the sector, other functions and departments within that organisation, local authority, for example, will not be au fait with the inner workings of the content of that. So what's going to be really important is that policies, procedures, standing orders, etc., are going to have to reflect not just the basic headlines and takeaways from the Act itself, but also the content of what we've discussed on today's podcast in terms of what's permissible, what is possible in terms of these routes to market, these new, reduced in number, but greater flexibility, improved opportunity for innovation, routes to market.
I guess whether one of the areas that they might want to do is, do they introduce some sort of approval in terms of how the process has been designed, in terms of has it got too many stages? Is it, those type of things? It might need to go, they might want to start thinking about that. Do we want to approve the processes that have been designed before it actually goes out to procurement?
Yeah, and we don't want to, I suppose, really add additional layers to what is already, and with the PCRs, and will continue under the guise of the new Act itself, additional stages if they're not necessary.
No, exactly. But it goes back to proportionality.
It does. But I think actually, again, it comes with the opportunity to, as you've rightly said just now, review, ensure that all bases have been covered, all options have been considered, to whatever route is taken by that public procuring organisation, ensure that they've selected an approach that will be able to allow them to generate optimum interest, and by way of an outcome of that procurement exercise, so the optimum interest from the marketplace itself, just to be clear, but then to generate a procurement exercise that results in the best possible outcome by way of the competitiveness of the evaluation exercise, the supplier that's being appointed, and beyond that point, the contract management deliverables, whether they be a commercial or qualitative output, or a combination of the two.
Yeah. going to be an interesting time, isn't it, in terms of what we see going forwards. So I think that's all we've got time for today in terms of our Routes to Market podcast. So thank you all for listening, and make sure to keep an eye out for our next podcast episode, which will be the other topic that was quite highly voted for in terms of our recent polls, which will be framework agreements. So we better get reading, hadn't we, in terms of framework agreements, because there's been a lot of questions on frameworks.
Quite a bit of research for us to be done,
yes,
in terms of preparing for that next podcast for sure. And as ever, any questions, any comments that you have in terms of the podcast and what we cover on our recordings, please raise them.
Yeah, we'd love to have those conversations and discussions with you, and make sure to, and I think as we mentioned in our last episode with Kieran, make sure to come and join our recently formed LinkedIn group, where we're sort of sharing information that we've seen and having those conversations and questions. So yeah, please feel free to come and join us over there as well. But in the meantime, keep an eye out for the next episode.
Bye for now.